Okay, so as with last week, and as we get towards the end of the course, we're getting into some really big issues, things that are very formative to the way our world operates today. And slavery, of course, is one of those, particularly here in the United States, where slavery and racism go hand in hand. Um, we don't actually have the ability to separate our modern problems with racism from our long history of slavery. But this is not unique to the United States. This actually does happen throughout almost all of the Western Hemisphere, because the form of slavery that evolves in the 1500s is very different from the forms of slavery that existed before. That is not a justification for slavery at any point in time. It is, though, a point at which we need to understand how slavery and its impact changes. So, with that in mind, I'm going to do a brief history of slavery itself and then attach it to racism and how it gets there. All right, maybe I am. Here we go. All right, so the agricultural revolution, way back at the beginning of this course, a million years ago, 12 weeks ago, we were talking about how we move from these effectively egalitarian societies where everybody wanders around as hunter gatherers, working cooperatively for the group as a whole to survive. But then we start settling down, and those people who can produce food, even though, as Harari tells you, it's that the great fraud of the agricultural revolution. But by the time people realize that, it's too late. It's generations into this lifestyle. What we get from it, though, is that it creates different status levels in society, right? I mean, that's a big point of what we've been talking about through the course. Producing food takes a lot of work. You know, as I said, we're so far removed from actual food production today that for us, work is going to the grocery store, buying the already ready to prepare food and putting it in the oven, right? I mean, if you have to spend half an hour cooking food, that seems to take a lot of time out of your day. Now we can just pop down to a convenience store, pop over to a fast food place, even go sit down somewhere, wait 15 minutes and have a fully prepared meal put in front of you. Um, you know, it is so foreign to us today to think about how much work goes into food production, that we honestly don't have a clue. Starting with the agricultural revolution and literally going almost all the way up into the mid 1900s, again, within the past, 50, 60 years, the better part of some person's day in every household, whether it was all the women and children during the agricultural revolution up until the 1800s, whether it was the woman of the house in the 18 and the 1900s doing it, somebody spent a lot of time producing food. And even by the time we get to the 1900s, it's not the actual act of having to kill the chicken and defeather it and then cut it up and figure out how you're going to cook it. By the 1900s, what you're looking at is, again, being able to run out of the grocery store and get that part of the job already done. So all you're doing is picking up the meat itself and then figuring out how you want to prepare it. Production of food is incredibly labor intensive. Um, at any point in time. And this leads to a marked stratification in society. Initially, those people who had settled down became targets for those people who had not settled down, who wanted the things that they produced, but also wanted to control those people who were producing it and the land that they produced it on. Right? So this is where we begin to get that initial stratification in society, that problematic issue between nomadic peoples and settled peoples that also goes through the course with us. But it also gets us to just how hard and labor intense this was, and how societies that started living near each other, if they wanted to increase the standard of living for their people, needed to go out and conquer more land, and even better, the people who were already on that land, so that those people could become the hard workers in the food production level. Of course, they didn't want to do this voluntarily, so they become slaves. This is a big part of why when we talk about warfare. Again, a lot of it was driven by the need to acquire more land and to acquire more people to do this work. All right, so slavery's been around for as long as humans have been on settled ground, right? But even at that point in time, people understood that this was hard work and that they, at some level, I don't want to say had to be grateful, but that the people who were doing this hard work were still people. They were still humans, right? In most societies, particularly in the ancient civilizations, slavery was not a heritable position. You didn't pass it to your children. Um, in most society, if slaves got married, their children would be free, even though, depending on where the slave was, if they were in a household that they liked and the people there wanted the children, they could also sell those children into slavery to repay a debt. Inversely, if the parent was a slave, they could find ways to raise money to buy themselves out of slavery. So slavery was a fluid concept in most societies, right? It was not static the way it becomes after 1500, and that's one of the other big points to bear in mind. Slavery existed in almost all ancient societies, those that we know of. It tends to show up in all kinds of law codes, but the significant point to that is in these law codes, they were recognized as a necessary part of society and therefore had certain protections. And this is a big deal. This is an acknowledgement on the part of the society itself that slaves were necessary and slaves had certain rights. Maybe not a lot of rights, maybe very elemental rights, but they still had certain rights. They were still people. Another key point, and this is a big part of where we come to by the 1500s, up until the 1500s, slavery was not racial. It was entirely based on proximity and on, if you want to say so, the luck of the people. Most slaves became slaves because they were captured in war. Sometimes they became slaves because they had debts that they couldn't pay off, and the only way to do that was to effectively sell their time and their bodies into the service of whomever they owed the debt to. Often, like I said, though, they could find ways to earn the money they needed to buy their way out of slavery, um, or ways to buy back their children if they had been forced to sell their children into slavery in order to pay off a debt. So, in a lot of ways, it really was a matter of proximity. Kingdoms conquered kingdoms, empires conquered empires. Again, the biggest reason being to acquire the land and the product of the land, but also the people who lived on that land and could do the production, right? In the classical civilizations, of course, bigger and bigger and bigger empires. It's estimated that at the height of the Roman Empire, approximately 30% of the population was slaves. And this was because the Romans were out conquering everything they could get their hands on. And this is going to continue from that point forward as empires get bigger and bigger. The ancient Greeks may have been the first society, we're not sure, speculation, may have been the first society that was literally called a slave society, in which the majority of the economy was based on the output of slaves, right? We know already from Frankopan the long history and migration of peoples conquered by the Vikings and other groups who were moved through North Africa, the Middle East, all through Eurasia itself, right? But slavery also existed in the Western Hemisphere. Mayans, Olmecs, Incans, all of them took war captives, used them as slaves for different functions. Africa, same thing. So slavery is just a pervasive part of almost all civilizations that we know of, right? Especially once they've settled down and have agriculture. Now, a number of you wanted to throw serfdom in the mix. And while some of the textbooks, I think Strayer and Nelson actually equate some levels of serfdom with slavery, most historians argue that it's a distinct political, well, actually, it's a distinct legal entity of its own. You can argue that it's short-term slavery. I have a hard time with that because even within the construct of serfdom itself and later indentured servitude, people couldn't take full advantage of them. Serfs were laborers, unquestionably. They were peasants. They were at the lowest rung in the ladder. But they had a right to the land on which they lived. And in fact, one of the big problems in the 16 and 1700s, as they're trying to break down the feudal system, is that they want to kick the serfs off the land so they can privatize the land and use it for other things. And the serfs resist wholeheartedly. They're like, no, this is, we've been entitled to this land. Our parents, our great grandparents, our great great grandparents, we've lived here forever. And part of the deal was that we had the right to work this land and to take part of the proceeds of that labor. Serfs themselves could not be bought and sold. Now, the land, which often happened, particularly in the early modern age with many of the formative rebellions and civil wars that go on, especially once the Protestant Reformation starts, the control of the land by aristocrats could shift. But the new incoming aristocrat who superseded the old one had no right to abuse the serfs as slaves. They couldn't sell them personally. They couldn't force them to do anything that wasn't actually part of the production of food or whatever on the land. They were legally protected, had a right to remain there, had a right to keep a portion of what they produced. And this was built into the whole construct of the feudal system. The other big part of that, of course, is that once the Western Hemisphere becomes an area of great production, attempts to actually drag serfs off of the land and make them go to the Western Hemisphere to do work failed. And they failed again because the serfs were not slaves. They could not be personally removed from the land they were on. All right, Africans, and I'll correct this when you see the PowerPoint, Africans have a long history of slavery themselves, tribal warfare, and you'll see this with Native Americans as well. This situation in which they um, compete amongst themselves in their smaller groups. Historically, they've been known as tribes. Most historians are moving away from using that as a word because it isn't completely accurate to the way these peoples organize themselves. They definitely were organized around kin groups and kin structures, but inversely, they often had unique languages and um, social and political customs that were central to the bands or organizations of people they were in. And they often fought with each other over territory, they fought with each other over labor. Um, and it was not uncommon for smaller groups to be defeated by larger groups, and in the same way that had been going on throughout the rest of history as we've seen it to this point, um, losing those sort of wars or internecine fights led to peoples being taken as war captives and or slaves. The distinction that we get to, though, is this idea of selling them. And often, as Franklin talks about in his chapter, The Road of Slaves, um, they could be sold to merchants who could take them as far away as Europe or the Middle East or even further away. So the Africans have already developed this sort of exchange system, at least in North Africa and along the Swahili coastline. So when the Portuguese start showing up in the 1400s and establishing their trading post empire along the coast of Africa, um, they're just another group of people that local African raiders can sell their product to. And it's not just slaves. I mean, they're selling gold, they're selling elephant tusks, they're selling wood, they're selling anything that's produced on the inside of Africa that is lucrative and beneficial to them. Slaves just happen to be another function of that. All right, but where it gets complicated again is that the one thing the Western Hemisphere opens up Europeans to is this idea of cash crops. Now, towards the end of this video, I'm going to talk about capitalism because that's intrinsic in the discussion question. And it's a lot of what comes out of this uh, ability now in the Western Hemisphere to mass produce certain food substances, and we also include the mining of silver in there, um, that are really labor intensive, but also incredibly lucrative. Lucrative to the point that people are seeing profits they've never seen before. I mean, this is really where we get to the point where we see a true emergence in trading and what becomes known as the middle class, those people who are making money off of the exchange of goods almost exclusively. And it's going to be part of what upends the feudal system in Europe because it creates a whole new level of wealth in a group of people who were not born to it, not hereditary wealth like the aristocracy who have control of land, but people who are making new money. And that's kind of the way we view it when we talk about industrialization in the West as well. It's a whole new class of people who are making money. They don't have title, they don't have nobility, but suddenly they have a tremendous amount of power and influence. One of the major products then is sugar. There's a really good video right here that I encourage you to watch that explains in great detail um, a lot of what sugar did, but also a lot of how horrific working on sugar plantation was. Now, the plantation system is also a new system for slavery. There have been agricultural slave concerns in the past. If you think of the Romans, they talk about the latifundias, which were large farm areas where you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slaves working to produce certain things. The plantation system is similar to that, but it is more complicated in that there are specific tasks that slaves have to do. And slaves are broken out by gender, by age, by size to do specific things on the plantation with the goal of producing effectively one thing. In this case, in the Caribbean, along the coastline of Brazil, it's going to be sugar because, again, the profit margin is so huge. White gold, as it becomes known in Europe, because of how much money they could make. But it's also very horrific work. Um, the average day is 12 to 18 hours long, particularly during the refining season when it is time to convert the sugar cane itself into a form that can be transported over the ocean to Europe. Working with sugar itself is difficult because sugar has to be pampered in a lot of ways. It's also very difficult to cut, so you could get injured very easily and constantly if you were either tending the sugar cane or if you were one of the ones cutting it. Once it's cut, it has to be processed very quickly, and what this literally means is taking the sugar cane to a mill, and by this sense, I mean a large grinding stone area where you have two stones, one on top of the other, and they are pulled in different directions, usually by slaves, where the cane is put between the two stones, which is very dangerous. People lose hands and arms often in the process of doing this because they're not quick enough to get their hands back out before the stones turn. The idea is to crush the cane down to the point that the pulp and the uh, syrup run out, but then that has to be collected and immediately boiled, which means that in the Caribbean, when this is happening and it's already very hot and humid, you have people who are having to work these huge fires with these huge iron pots on them with this heavy, thick, boiling sugar in it. So injuries happened constantly, chronically. People were burned. People died when they couldn't carry these pots with all of this stuff in it. I mean, it's just really horrible. So the work on the sugar plantation itself is incredibly labor intensive, incredibly dangerous, and incredibly hard. And the profit margin from sugar and later from coffee and other things, cotton, another one, was so high that it was literally cheaper to work slaves to death and buy a new one than it was to invest in trying to take care of them. And this is where we get to what is called chattel slavery. This is the big, big difference between the types of slavery that existed prior to the 1500s and those that come after. And it's this construct of chattel slavery. Now, the first slaves in the Western Hemisphere for the Europeans were Native Americans. They arrived, Columbus himself uh, and some of the early conquistadors demanded that the natives give surrendered to them all of their gold and silver, and of course to many of the natives. We've heard the stories about the Aztecs and the Incas. They didn't value gold and silver the way the Europeans did. They did some beautiful work with it. Incan metalworking was phenomenal. They would take the gold and they would roll it literally into fine sheets that they could then make masks or other house decorations out of. I mean, they had some tremendously talented jewelers who could work with the gold itself, which is very fine and very flaky and very delicate, and literally roll it into long sheets that they could use to cover other things and make beautiful with. And they, they used it as decorations, particularly in the houses. They didn't think of it as something that valuable. To them, their mechanism of exchange was in quetzal feathers or in other bird feathers or in seashells or in other, various and sundry things that to them were significant and important. They hadn't been in touch with Europe or with Eurasia since before the ice ages, so they didn't develop the same ideas about what was money, literally, what would be the mechanism of exchange. In Eurasia, of course, gold and silver were the big ones, gold, silver, and then beautiful gemstones, right? Um, these became the things that you could trade up until the development of money, which was effectively a piece of paper that was a promise that you could get value from it, right? Which is kind of the same way we view money today. Um, for Native Americans, it wasn't gold or silver, so they were kind of baffled by this desire on the part of these weird white guys who show up that this is what they want. But they gave them what they had. Unfortunately for Columbus, that wasn't nearly enough. He actually begins the process of forcing the natives to produce other things for him. And the natives, who were semi-sedentary at that point, weren't exactly all that happy about what he wanted. Of course, he was altering their lifestyle entirely. And so when they refused to give him what he wanted, he started maiming and beating them and effectively enslaving them. He took numbers of them over to Spain, some of which made it, but not most, because most of them died, of course, of the diseases that the Native Americans had had no exposure to, because they had never lived not only with these Europeans, but with the animals that the Europeans had domesticated. Indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere had a few domesticated animals, but nowhere near on the scale of what the Europeans and Eurasians had. Um, if you look, I think most of your textbooks actually have examples of what animals were indigenous to the Western Hemisphere and which ones were indigenous to Eurasia. And the number that were indigenous to Eurasia is much higher than the ones in the Western Hemisphere. And this is a big part of what Diamond talks about, right? All right, so over the course of apparently 300 years, 60 to 90% of Native Americans, and again, these figures are in dispute, but at least 60, everybody agrees that's a minimum. How high it goes, we're not sure, but estimates have gone as high as 90%, died from European diseases. In the same way that the bubonic plague and other diseases come, kill off a huge part of the population, go into remission, and then come back when the next generation of people develops that they can target, it goes in waves. The same thing happens with the Native Americans. Europeans enslaved the ones that survived when they could, but many of these enslaved peoples now, because their immune systems were so weakened from fighting off the initial rounds of disease, either died from the intensity of the labor itself, or because they were familiar with the landscape of the Western Hemisphere, because most slaves were being enslaved close to where they had already lived, they could run away and they could find places to hide. One of the more interesting things that we'll see, particularly in Central and South America, is the development of what are called maroon communities, M-A-R-O-O-N. These are mixed communities of Native Americans and Africans. When Africans could escape from slavery and captivity, they would often be welcomed and embraced by local hiding Native American communities. Most of these maroon communities would develop in the mountains or in areas that it was very difficult for Europeans to get into or to find their way out of. Into areas where the peoples who were living in these communities could well defend themselves. So maroon communities are a fascinating area of study in the history of the Western Hemisphere, because these really are some of the first syncretic, to use this word not about religion, but about culture, um, some of the first really interesting syncretic communities in the Western Hemisphere, the merging of Africans and Native American societies, right? Europeans would consider Native Americans to be inferior primarily because of the resistance of most Native Americans to European customs and religion. Um, there's a long effort of resistance. And when we talked about syncretic religions last week, one of the things I did try to show you were the ways in which many indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere did attempt to reconcile their own religions with those of the Europeans, particularly with Christianity. But in many ways, this was also a demonstration to most Europeans that Native Americans were just not as smart as they were, right? All right. So the importation of Africans happens basically because of the death of so many Native Americans, the fact they just couldn't keep them. Um, African slaves were already available. The Portuguese already were trading extensively in them, particularly into the Middle East and back up into the Mediterranean. So just shifting the demand from those areas into the Western Hemisphere was not that difficult. And in fact, Portugal itself, Brazil was their major claim to territory in the Western Hemisphere, and also where there were substantial uh, ability to grow sugar and coffee, both of which were extremely lucrative. Again, looking at this list at the bottom here, 12 million Africans were forcibly embarked, taken from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. About 10 million made it. 45% of those would end up in Brazil, again, because the value there of sugar and other commodities was so profitable. It was easier to work slaves to death. The British, French, Dutch, and Danish Caribbean, again, sugar there principally, and coffee, 37%. Spanish America, 11%. The big thing for the Spanish, and I tried mentioning this several places in here, was silver mining. Um, they really, really wanted Africans to do the mining because Native Americans were extremely resistant. They would rather die than go underground to mine the silver. So, and then of course North America itself, which would eventually become the United States, around 4%, right? So, thank you. This also then gets us to this concept, the evolution of the idea of race. Now, I've had some interesting answers on this part. And there is still some speculation about exactly where race comes into it. But it is pretty clear that concepts of race didn't actually exist at all until maybe the 14, 1500s. And even then, it was initially used to refer to families, people who were descended from the same patriarch or the same progenitor would consider themselves to be a specific race. It didn't have to do at that point in time, though, with skin color. Um, it's not until, well, until the beginning of the decline of slavery in Eurasia that it becomes associated with race, and that's primarily in the Western Hemisphere. The decline in the slave trade in Eurasia is brought about by a number of different things, not the least of which was the defeat by the Ottomans of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople being a central point for the slave trade, the movement of slaves between Europe and the Middle East and other places. Once the Ottomans took Constantinople, that market declined. Also, the decline of the Vikings themselves, who were principal traders along that route. It basically broke down the broad level of trade. You're still going to get localized trade in areas of slaves, but that's also going to limit slavery to those areas, right? All right. So it becomes something very much associated for Europeans with the Western Hemisphere, where they're looking at someone and determining their skin color made it much easier to categorize them as slaves or to lock them into that, to argue that Dark skin particularly became associated with inferiority and with difference. That these were people who often rejected European customs, particularly European Christianity, particularly Catholicism. Um, Pretty much ties it into as a reason to believe or to consider them to be inferior and therefore not human. And the key thing here is this idea that they are not human. This quote from Roediger, which I really like, during the 17th century, the European Enlightenment philosophers based their ideas on the importance of secular reasoning, rationality, and scientific study, as opposed to faith-based religious understandings of the world. Philosophers and naturalists were categorizing the world anew and extending such thinking to the people of the world. These new beliefs, which evolved starting in the late 17th century and flourished through the late 18th century, argued that there were natural laws that governed the world and that governed human beings. Over centuries, the false notion that white people were inherently smarter, more capable, and more human than non-white people became accepted worldwide. This categorization of people became a justification for European colonization and subsequent enslavement of people from Africa. And of course, it goes on from there. If you read the Roediger piece, which I do encourage you, it's really, really good. It extends that also into colonization, even or second wave colonization, even after slavery is abolished throughout the 1800s. There's still that sense throughout the 1800s and even in the 1900s that people of color are still inferior and need to be civilized, and I put civilized in air quotes. If you could see me, you would see I'm doing that, by Western culture, Western ideology, and Western religion. So there is another excellent video here, The Origins of Race in the U.S., which actually covers not just race in the U.S., but race throughout the period that we're talking about right here in this early modern period and how it evolves, right? All right, I encourage you again to watch that. Okay. Capitalism. Now, it's kind of strange here, but we're going to talk about what this thing is that we call capitalism. Is this idea that, um, well, okay, it comes out of trade. No question about it. It is directly related to the idea of making money and the idea that if you have money to invest in something, then you should get a cut back of the profits that come from that investment. And you should be able to make those investments however you want to, right? All right. So where we are with this is that capitalism is evolving in this period. Now, I'm not going to say, obviously, every society we've talked about has had traders, and these traders have been in it principally to uh, trade goods and to profit from the trade of those goods, right? So capitalism's been around. What we're really talking about is the massive expansion of capitalism and the way in which it transforms these agricultural societies into something else, right? Okay. It is capitalism becomes kind of formative to our understanding of the modern world, definitely, and it begins in this early modern world period. Okay, these massive profits that are coming off of the Western Hemisphere are going to reconfigure the economies not only of Western Europe, but of all of Eurasia, literally. Initially, monarchies are going to hold this wealth. They're going to develop a system called mercantilism, in which they basically say, okay, well, we're trying to protect the money that's in the empire itself. And we're going to do this by keeping as much of the money in the empire as possible. We do this by regulating who people can trade with, what goods can be traded to whom, um, by taxing goods that are being traded to other empires or people from other empires more heavily than those that are being traded within the empire itself, and by controlling how many products can be produced, right? This is a kind of governmental control of the economy. But by the 1700s, there are a lot of private investors who are getting really frustrated with this. And this is a big part of what we see when we talk about eventually, we don't actually get to it until right at the end of this course, the ideas behind the revolution of the British North American colonies, revolutions in Central and South America, and in other areas in the Western Hemisphere, where the colonies and the leaders of the colonies, who are, of course, the rich men in the colonies, are getting very frustrated with the government effectively taking their money as they see it, and not letting them trade or spend their money where they want to. So this is a big part of what drives a lot of those revolutions. What we're talking about right now, though, in the relationship between capitalism and slavery, is that it's a big driver of the slave trade and the chattel slavery construct, right? I encourage you again, a third video, a really excellent one, explaining the relationship between capitalism and slavery and how it is born literally out of the transatlantic slave trade. All right, so to sum up here are the works cited, but again, I encourage you to go back and watch the videos therein. And this was the Roediger article, Historical Foundations of Race, really, really good, from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the newest Smithsonian museum to open. Chattel slavery of the 1500s, extraordinarily different from the slaveries that came before it, principally because it was not just turning people into property, but making them not people. And the reason for that was because they needed a clear separation between the people doing, or the slaves doing, the hard work, who they did not think of as people, and the people profiting from it, right? And the fact they couldn't get anybody else to do it. Here's some people we can get to do it. Interestingly, a lot of these ideas of race come along at the same time that we're seeing the Enlightenment, which was arguing, of course, that people had the right as individuals to make their own choices and do their own thing. So, yeah, it's really kind of interesting when you look at it and think, here we have all these wonderful ideas about individualism and being independent of government control and people having natural laws and natural rights, but then we have to take a whole section of the population that we need to keep enslaved in order to make this money. So we have to find ways to say they're not people. And that's what chattel slavery is. All right, if you have questions, email me. Otherwise, think about this in terms of, well, if you're doing the extra credit assignment, think about this in terms of that as well.